Every cup of coffee begins years before you ever touch the grinder. And the Specialty Coffee Association requires baristas to learn how that coffee was grown, how that coffee was processed, how that coffee was roasted in order to begin to be able to brew it. There you go. I started YouTube with the desire to break down this paywall that tends to be erected in the coffee industry for baristas to get on bar. They have to be able to afford classes, or they need to get some sort of certification, or they have to sign a non-disclosed agreement with a company so that they don't take their training and share it with another company they may go to in the future, which we shouldn't even mention non-compete clauses that I see all the time. Yes, I was continuing with theory, but I really got into the esoterica, right? The esoteric things. And now when people hop on my channel, they don't know where to start. They see that there's potentially conflicting information, which if you watched from the very beginning, it's not. But, if you don't, it can be very confusing. So what I wanted to do was take the SCA Barista Skills course, and I'm going to bring them out in bingeable chunks of 20-minute videos. And by the end of the series, you will have essentially the SCA training. We'll cover coffee species and varieties, origins, processing, roasting, freshness, and storage. And following that, we'll finish with a little bit of water. Now first we need to look at species and varieties. So species, we know what a species is. Let's look at fruits. Apple is a species, pear is a species. In coffee we have two main species that we concern ourselves with, Arabica and we have Canephora. Now Canephora, you're more used to the term Robusta, but when we talk about species, these are the terms we'll be using. Arabica tends to be a bit more mild. It's lower caffeine than Canephora. It has a bit more florality, a bit more citrusy. It's just a more pleasant overall experience, and why it's kind of the poster child of specialty coffee due to its flavor profile, but it's much more difficult to grow and is much more sensitive. There are lots of people that are trying to reclaim the name of Robusta or Canephora in order to show that it can compete with Arabica, which is a valiant thing and very cool to see. But typically, Canephora is reserved for these darker roasts that you see maybe throughout Italy or in France, or you'll see it in instant coffee mixes. So this is a much more bold, much more high caffeine, much more intense, less dynamic and complex style of coffee that is much more resistant to lots of fungi and lots of bug infestation and climate changes, and is much easier to grow, but it tends to not fetch as high of scores whenever people are tasting them. Next, we have what we call varieties, and let's go back to an apple example. Within apples, you have Fuji, you have Granny Smith, you have Golden Delicious. Within coffee, under Arabica, the species, we have different varieties like SL28 or SL34, Ruriru, and Batian, Catuai, and we have Caturro, Bourbon, and Tipico, Gesha, which are very prized for their delicate nature and their intense citric acidity. So within varieties, there are lots of different ones, and they all kind of add to the flavor complexity in one way or another. Just like when we taste a Granny Smith and a Fuji apple, they taste very different. One is sour, one is really sweet. Same thing happens with our coffees. They all have their own intrinsic taste properties. Of course, we have some beans that are a lot more dense based off of their variety, but some of the same variety can be more dense than counterparts in their variety if they're grown at higher altitudes, for instance. The higher up it is, the more dense the bean becomes because it needs to protect itself against the more inclement weather that is higher up. It tends to create more sugar in order to surround and protect itself. The way that it is grown, where it is grown, whether it's direct in the sun or in the shade, or if it's overwatered, underwatered, given much soil, given not as much nutrients in its soil, this is all going to affect the bean's properties. Are there direct correlations to more dense bean equals more sweet? People have tried to make those correlations, but a friend of mine, Christopher Ferran, has track this, and there's no real correlation between a lot of these different properties. They will help you understand how they extract, though, to an extent. A more dense bean tends to be a bit harder to extract than a less dense bean counterpart roasted to the same degree, but even that's a difficult thing to really say. Now, the geography and the terroir, or the land it was grown on, these things largely shape the raw material. When we talk about altitude, soil, climate, all these things create the terroir. Higher altitudes slow down the cherry maturation, which allows these sugars, and it allows the acids to develop more fully. That's why you have, like, a washed Ethiopia from 2,000 meters tastes bright and floral, while a low altitude Brazilian might taste chocolatey and nutty. So you have our coffee cherries, which we have a cross-section of one right here on my arm. There are two seeds in most cherries hugging each other. To extract those from the seed, we call that processing. Now, processing is where we do impart a decent amount of flavor onto the bean itself. In fact, one research paper from about 10 years ago argues that about 60% of the bean's flavor comes from the processing. What are discussed are the three kind of traditional ways of processing. So first would be natural, the most historic, which is you pick the cherry off the tree and you toss it in the sun to ferment naturally. Or you put it on a raised bed like is so common in Africa in order to have a bit more evenness of the dryness going around the seed as opposed to being on the ground. That cherry that surrounds the seed begins to rot and rot and rot, and it imparts flavors due to chemical reactions that are going on inside until boom, you scrape it and that skin just kind of goes away in the dirt. And then you kind of rake it around and you let that dried dead skin fall off. Honey process. You can do this with your fingers. It's actually kind of fun. If you ever visit a coffee farm, you take a cherry from the tree and you squeeze and the seed will pop right on out. Now the seed is covered in a sticky mucilage-like substance, which is called the mucilage. It's kind of snotty. And that is what they call the honey, right? So it tends to be quite sweet and it's filled with sugar. It's very sugar rich. Then you put that in the sun, you let that ferment without the skin around it, so without that flesh, without that cherry skin, and so it gives it a less intense fermentation, though a fermentation nonetheless, and then you take it, you wash it, you take it out of the parchment, bada bing, you have a honey processed. Then finally we have washed process, which essentially you immediately depulp the coffee, so we're taking it, we're squeezing it, normally it's going through little rollers. You can manually have this or have an automated one, and the cherry goes through and pops the seed out, and so you can do a ton at a time. Then you have these deep cherried seeds inside parchment with mucilage on it sitting inside of a tiled tub. You let that sit, you let that ferment. Everything has fermentation in coffee, so if you say, I don't want a fermented coffee, well, you're not drinking coffee. All of them require fermentation in order for there to be that end cup that we all enjoy. Anyway, after that, it goes through, you wash it down, and then you take the parchment off, you roast it. There are loads of alternatives nowadays like anaerobic processing and co-fermenting and infusions and loads of things that are going on nowadays, which we won't really get into because we're doing beginning and intermediate now, but maybe in future videos we can do something like that, or keep your eyes peeled because I hear Christopher Fran may be popping into Porto soon. Next we have decaffeination. Now I've done a full video on decaf. If you really want to get into weeds, you can go check that out. Or my friend James Hoffman has videos where he has visited decaf facilities in order to really get into these different types like supercritical CO2, like ethyl acetate, Swiss water. But these are very common ways of decaffeination. You know, in the SCA training, they want to ensure that baristas don't explain decaf coffee as bad, but as kind of a different method, and the quality depends on the method and on the green coffee itself. So you have solvent-based decaffeination, which is like ethyl acetate, which can be made from sugarcane. It's very efficient, very affordable, and I think produces some of the best tasting coffees, very natural type of thing. You have Swiss water, which is chemical-free, uses water essentially. Again, it's described in my decaf video. We have the supercritical CO2 process, which is very high-tech. It's gentle on flavors, but it makes the beans a bit darker. So this whole death before decaf, that can have its own death. We need decaf before death. I love me some decaf. We also need to talk about storage and transport. So this is important for baristas to understand at least, because there are times people say, oh, what crop is this coffee? What's the crop year on it? Oh, this tastes baggy. What do these terms mean? Historically, they're shipped in kind of jute bags, which are these like burlap sacks. And normally there's no real lining on the inside, so it's very accessible to water and to the different air and climates. So water gets in, it can cause mold on the beans, it can cause a lot of different issues in its transport, completely crushing the quality. So some years ago, people began to use Grain Pro, which is essentially a plastic type of lining on the inside of these jute bags that will keep the beans safe during transit. It's important to understand that moisture content is a factor in how the coffee is going to taste upon arrival. In fact, at origin, they tend to, especially at ones that have the means to do this, they will check with different devices the moisture reading during the processing to ensure that it's at a specific range. Now, normally we're looking at green coffee in the range of like 9 to 12% moisture. Now, of course, it can vary slightly outside of that. It depends on the origin, depends on the type of coffee, depends on how you're storing it, but there is a type of water percentage that roasters and importers are looking for with these coffees. So the transport is very important when you get it from the farm to the processing facility, from the processing facility to wherever it is finalized to the exporter, from the exporter to the destination country, from the destination country to the importer or to the roaster themselves. There's a lot of travel there, up to 2 or 3 months, maybe even more if it's sitting at an importer for a long time or sitting at an exporter for a long time. So the way that the green coffee is stored and managed is very important to maintain its quality or to not lose as much quality as you can. Unless the place is freezing their green coffee, if it's a year off crop, it likely is going to taste baggy or old or stale. There are a lot of different flavor notes that can come up from past crop coffees. But on the other side, too fresh of coffee can also be a negative. I have found that sometimes you want the green coffee to rest a bit before you begin. It can have too high of moisture content. There are people that are trying to, which I think is a terrible idea, but they'll fly in directly coffee from origin within a week of it being picked, trying to use that as a marketing ploy that they have the freshest crop to cup. I think that's silly. I've not found a coffee where it tastes that great 2 weeks off of the tree. So there are people on this side of the aisle that drink Starbucks daily, and for them, the blonde roast is maybe light. But then there are people on the other edge of the end of the aisle that only drink things like the Picky Chemist, and for them, that's their light, and then ultra light would be substance. So you have people on these two different sides of the aisle where they are not able to communicate effectively in the slightest. Right now, it's difficult to have a common conversation on light, medium, dark due to this. So we're going to have to speak in terms of relativity. So for those of you at home that are used to darker coffees and like a Starbucks blonde is light roast for you, what I'm about to say can be used relatively in the same way that for people on the other side of the aisle, it's all relative. It becomes more and more difficult to extract the lighter the coffee is, more and more easy to extract the darker the coffee is. The lighter you go, for the most part, relative to where you're at, you're going to get more acidity. You're going to get more fruity characteristics. It's going to be a bit better for filter brews. It's going to be a bit more tricky for espresso, and it's going to be more dense, less brittle, less soluble. The opposite is true with dark roast. You get more solubility. You get a lot less dense. You get a lot more brittle. You're going to get a lot more fines created. You'll have a much bigger window for decent extractions because there's a lot less to extract. You've burnt out a lot of the characteristics of the coffee. You're going to have a much smaller window of what the flavor profile can be, but a much bigger window in which to attain that. So you'll get a lot more bitter chocolate, caramel, malted flavors, but a lot more bitterness, smokiness, and the like. You'll also get a lot more thick crema, which a lot of people tend to love, which is that, creamy type of foamy substance on top. Then, of course, medium would be essentially the middle of those extremes for wherever you're at relative to your coffee preferences. When coffee is roasted, it creates CO2 inside the beans. In addition to that, the water inside, remember we talked about a high water percentage, it continues to expand due to the heat and eventually it creates a pop in order to expel from the bean itself. We call this first crack. Now what I mean by crack, by the way, is it sounds like popcorn popping. You actually have a little shroud of mist kind of carries around the bean and we get a little weird dip in the temperature. It's a whole science when it comes to roasting, but essentially we have an expulsion of water. That doesn't mean all the water is gone, but a large bit of it is. Obviously, when we see a green bean versus a roasted bean and we squeeze them and we feel them, we poke them, you can tell there's more water in the green bean. Now, if you continue to apply heat quite a bit, you'll get a second crack. With the second crack, you'll have a lot of that CO2 expanding or releasing from the bean itself, but typically it wants to stay within the bean during that roasting process because most roasters are releasing the bean prior to second crack. All the CO2 stays inside of that roasted bean, and that's why, for instance, if you buy fresh coffee and there's no valve on it, that coffee bag will expand and could potentially pop. We have one-way valves on these bags, something like this, a one-way valve that will allow CO2 to escape without bringing in oxygen. Because of the way it's sized, it allows the CO2 to escape. Well, CO2 can cause a lot of issues. First off, it causes issues during extraction. CO2 wants to release from the coffee grounds after you grind it up. The main way to release it, other than grinding it up and letting it sit, is hot water. It will enter the bean. It wants to begin diffusion, which it does begin pretty immediately, but the only way to get the things out of the coffee that we actually want in our cup is first it has to expel the CO2. That's why you see a bloom. That's why you see that golden foam that rises with a pour over. Or that's why you see those really thick drops of thick, creamy syrup coming out of your espresso machine, but then they can dissipate really quickly with bubbles. And that's because it's CO2. That's surfactants are rolling off the CO2 bubbles and they're popping. So you can start with crema that's this thick with espresso and it ends up being that thick because it was really fresh coffee. Or you can have like chunky crema because the coffee's so fresh. CO2 gives you gassy, uneven shots because it's much harder for diffusion to be efficient in a small time window when you have that much CO2. So you kind of want espresso to be arrested a bit. I would say the darker the roast, the less the rest. The lighter the roast, the more the rest. Now, there is more crema with darker roasted coffees than lighter roasted coffees when you brew it freshly. But the darker you roast something, the bigger the pores become on the surface of the bean itself, the easier it is for the gas to release. In addition to that, there's a lot less that it can lose, and so you want to have it a bit sooner off roast so that you get something before it becomes kind of quote-unquote stale, as some people have called it. Light roast, much smaller pores, there's also a bit more water left in the bean that will allow for some maturation that can go on to where you can have an improved coffee after some time, potentially, depending on the roaster that is used and the coffee. If the coffee's too fresh, it could be sour, it could be a weird foamy texture, and that's because it was difficult to extract. If it's too old, it becomes a little bit harder to dial in. It can still be delicious, but it could taste a bit stale. So you might be asking, well, what's the optimal use window? Well, it depends. This is where you're not going to have a satisfactory answer because it could be anywhere from 5 days to 4 months. It depends on the roast level, depends on the coffee itself. So for instance, if you're using a really dark roasted coffee, I would recommend consuming it within like maybe a 5 to 14 day window. If you're doing more of a medium style roast, let's say medium is something like a Starbucks blonde or like a darker American style roast in the specialty world, then I would recommend something like a 7 to 20 day window. If you're doing a lighter roasted coffee, let's say a specialty coffee from the US or something along those lines, I would recommend something like 10 days to around 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. And then if you're going like a Nordic light roast, maybe somewhere around 2 weeks to, I don't know, maybe 5 weeks. And then if you're going with the really, really light stuff, anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 months. So it really just depends. There's a huge window, and I know that's not satisfactory, but I would say for the majority viewer watching this, don't be overly concerned with this. Taste coffee. When you find a consistent window where it tastes the best, just aim for that window and continue there. There is no such thing as fresh is best. Be okay if you go to a cafe, a coffee shop, and there's a 3-week off roast bean. If it's a light roast, it might be fantastic. Light, that's an enemy. That can ruin your coffee. Too much oxygen or oxygen at all can ruin your coffee. So open the bag as infrequently as possible. In fact, if you want to dose into one-way valve tubes that you can buy online, those are great. Those are great. Do that once and then let it sit, and it'll last a lot longer than if you keep it in a bag and open and close and open and close and open and close, because you're oxidizing the beans, and that is going to negatively affect it. If you are a wine drinker or a bourbon drinker or something along those lines, you know how oxidation can absolutely ruin your beverage. Same thing with coffee. You don't want too much oxygen. The CO2, you need that to escape for the very, very first few days. But after that, you just don't want oxygen in there. What about the vacuum canisters? I think those are largely inefficient because you're still open and closing and you're not getting all the oxygen out. And even if you do, the seal's never going to hold. I've tried a ton of them. They don't hold well at all. Try to consume all of it within 4 or 5 days, or like within as short a window as possible. Or right when you buy it, split it into 2 bags. One of them keep completely sealed, get all the oxygen out, and toss it to the side, and don't touch it. Put it in a cabinet, drink what you have, and you can rotate through other beans and come back to it. Or toss half of it in the freezer. When you're ready, take it out, single dose it, or just use it as your bag out on the counter, whatever it might be. In our cups of coffee, if it's filter coffee, over 98% of it is water. In our espresso, over 90% of it is water. In our soup, about 92% of it is water. So water is very, 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 very important. So understanding what's in your water can greatly contribute to the taste of your coffee, because minerals can bond with the minerals in the coffee or the extractants in the coffee to make different flavors. So in water, we have 2 big things: general hardness, which refers to the magnesium and calcium. We have carbonate hardness, referring to the alkalinity. Magnesium is said to affect the complexity, the sweetness, and different things of coffee. So you add some magnesium, you can get some fun kind of results. I just recommend that you try it yourself. Do big quantities so you can really see, okay, this definitely has a lot more magnesium. What is going on with it? Calcium is said to aid with some body, some chocolatiness, maybe some creaminess. But if too much of it can taste chalky or it can taste dead, muted, etc. Carbonate hardness. Now this refers to the bicarbonates, the buffer of the coffee. In any acid, you can have a base, and the base will neutralize the acids, right? You have something that's a 5, you can add a 9, and you can help to even that out closer to 7, right? It neutralizes the acid. We have something very common like baking soda, which is sodium bicarbonate. Now this is a very simple to get your hands on the carbonate hardness. You add that to a coffee, it is going to buffer out the acidity. It's going to add a hydrogen atom to the acidity, taking away the acidic property, and it's going to mute a lot of that perceived acidity. Of course, we don't want any chlorine, we don't want any off smells, we don't want any off flavors. There are the obvious metals and whatnot you don't want in your coffee, but as long as all of that is contained, the ones we want to focus on are general hardness with calcium magnesium, carbonate hardness. TDS is that overall measured total dissolved solids, which you can get from an electroconductivity meter, which looks like this right here. So it has 2 prongs. It measures the electric current inside, and it gives you a rough total dissolved solid in parts per million. This is a pretty misleading number though, because people then think that's the combination or the addition, the product of the carbonate hardness and the general hardness. If you have 40 parts per million of general hardness and 40 parts per million of carbonate hardness, people think that boom, TDS is 80. But that's not how that works. So TDS can be quite misleading, and it doesn't tell us the story. So they recommend a 150 ppm, but acceptable range is 75 to 250. I say throw that out the window. We don't need to pay attention to that. 250 would mute your coffee. That's a crazy high number. Hardness, they recommend 50 to 175 ppm as calcium carbonate. We won't get into it, but that's a way to measure your ppm is in calcium carbonate ions. Alkalinity, they recommend 40 to 70. I would say that's a great alkalinity for espresso. For filter, I recommend anywhere from 0 to like 30 for filter coffee. pH 6 to 8. A lot of people worry about pH. I wouldn't really worry about pH. Just don't be drinking acid or base, all right? With really low TDS water, you can have a flat brew that might be really acidic, and it's a sharp acidity that isn't pleasant. With a really high TDS, like 200, 300, you can have chalky, muted, muddy type of brews. So you can really focus, especially in nuanced, complex coffees, you can really bring out difficult to taste tasting notes when you really focus in on your water. That brings us to the end of our jam-packed first video in this series of how to become a barista, and I guess that's closer to 30 minutes. I don't even know at this point, but it doesn't really matter because we covered it all. I went through and I found outlines online. This is not me taking their actual curriculum. It's me filling it in. And it's probably better than what you're gonna get for $750 and a certificate. You get to sit down, binge a video on YouTube, and now you're going to understand what is being taught in these classes. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like and subscribe. Share this to a friend that might need a little bit of help getting into the coffee world. Share it to a friend that might be looking to get a job at a cafe. Or if you're a cafe and you want to use this in your training curriculum, feel free to do so because, you know, we're here to help everyone. But, you know, hit that like, subscribe, hit the bell notification. All of this really helps the channel, helps me to do the research so that I can share that with you all instead of relying on paying for overpriced certifications. But that's about it. I thank you for watching. I have a Patreon down below if you feel compelled to contribute and to join the Discord that I have there where we do a lot of live things. In addition to that, I have a second YouTube called Unfiltered where I go on rants it's going to start being pretty frequent now. We do cool competitions on my Patreon to have people win machines. Also, if you like golf, I also started a golf channel where I drink coffee on golf courses and play terrible golf, but it's a lot of fun. Anyway, all of that you can see down below, but thank you so much for watching. I love making these videos. I love communing with you all, and yeah, hope this was helpful. The most important thing, though, more than all of that education, more than all the blah, 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 is that I hope you brew something tasty today. And cheers.